of heaviness is full of heaviness. Thy rebuke hath broken his heart. He looked for some to have pity on him, but there was no man, neither found he any to comfort him. He looked for some to have pity on him, but there was no man, neither found he any to comfort him. Behold, and see, behold, and see, if there be any sorrow like unto his sorrow. Behold and see if there be any sorrow like unto his sorrow. Behold and see if there be any sorrow unto his sorrow. He was cut off out of the land of the living for the transgression of thy people was he stricken.
So that was tenor Everett Suttle with the Schiller Institute NYC chorus, the section of Handel's Messiah, which is appropriate to the day, namely Good Friday. And I think this is extremely important. It is Good Friday. It is also the beginning of Passover. It is also the midst of Ramadan. So it is a season when people of these great religions are hopefully reflecting on the relationship between mankind and our Creator, and therefore the relationship between human beings as well. I wanted to dwell a moment on this question of what Good Friday represents, because the conception is going to prove to be very important if mankind is going to come forward out of the crisis we are currently facing. The idea that Christ gave his life, and at Gethsemane, we know that not only was it God's will, but that Christ had to also make a decision that it was his will to give his life so that mankind could be forgiven their sins, even though the people for whom he was dying did not seem to appreciate it. In fact, the population wasn't that good. When they had a choice to vote who should be spared and who should be crucified, they chose to spare Barabbas and crucify Christ. So that's a very tough question, because we have some confusion today in our society about the difference between justice and revenge. Is revenge just? What is justice? What is the relationship between justice and truth? When is it necessary to respond harshly to something? I would argue before a great crime is committed, before harm is going to come to other human beings, then it may be necessary to take action. But after the fact, how does one respond? Also, this gets to the question of Martin Luther King, the principle of nonviolent direct action. Why did he, a student of Mahatma Gandhi, insist that people had to follow the Christian idea of loving one's enemies? And I would encourage everyone to think about what happens to your own mind when you are enraged, when you hate someone or something. What is your quality of thinking? What's the quality in your mind versus when you're able to free yourself from the encumbrance of that kind of hatred, that kind of rage, and liberate your mind to think clearly? And we've seen some horrible examples of this kind of hatred recently. One is the punishment of the newborn babies of Afghanistan, because the United States and NATO could not win a war against the Taliban in Afghanistan, and we finally left that country. We have decided to steal their money and make sure that they are starving. So since January, over 13,000 newborn infants in Afghanistan have died. Now, is that just? Is that an appropriate response to the tragedy that occurred on September 11th? Does it have anything to do with the truth? That's something to think about. And we're going to be seeing famine all over the world if we continue, and I'll get to that in a second. Related to this question, also, I wanted to read this speech from Portia in The Merchant of Venice, where she is urging, again, it's the question, the difference between mercy and justice, or what's written in the rule of law, that having been unable to pay a debt, is one entitled to extract a pound of flesh? Is that justice? Just as we saw when LaRouche in 2007 issued something called the Homeowners and Bank Protection Act, because many, many people were about to be foreclosed upon. And some people argued about LaRouche's policy, which said that no one should be foreclosed upon in the crisis, and they should all be given the opportunity to renegotiate their loans, renegotiate their mortgages. And people who were opposed to this said, yes, but they signed a contract. They signed a contract. So what is real? What has bearing in the universe under God's eyes as the principle of natural law, what is just? What is merely contract law? That's a similar question here, so I'll go ahead and read this now. You can read along with me. The quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. It is twice blessed. It blesseth him that gives and him that takes. 'Tis mightiest in the mightiest. It becomes the throned monarch better than his crown. His scepter shows the force of temporal power, the attribute to awe and majesty, wherein doth sit the dread and fear of kings. But mercy is above this sceptered sway. It is enthroned in the hearts of kings. It is an attribute to God himself, and earthly power doth then show likest God's when mercy seasons justice. Therefore, Jew, though justice be thy plea, consider this, that in the course of justice, none of us should see salvation. We do pray for mercy, and that same prayer doth teach us all to render the deeds of mercy. So we have a situation now where Russia, thanks to inaction from or non-response from the United States and NATO, decided that to prevent genocide of the Russian-speaking population in eastern Ukraine, and also to prevent nuclear war, an action had to be taken. And I learned only today something I think is extremely significant, which is that Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, had actually announced an official policy that Ukraine was going to take back Crimea. And this was announced on March 21st, 2021. Crimea, for people who don't know or remember, had voted, I believe in 2014, not long after the coup, may have been 2015, but not long after the 2014 coup, in which the Obama-Biden administration installed a pro-Nazi regime in Kiev, which had committed brutal massacres against Russian-speaking people, including a hideous incident in Odessa where people who were protesting the coup were herded into a building which was boarded up and set on fire, and they were burned to death. So Crimea, which was 90% Russian-speaking, held a referendum, and they voted 96% to leave Ukraine and rejoin the Russian Federation. This was not an invasion by Putin. This was not an annexation, even though we imposed sanctions against Russia because of this. So if in March of 2021, Zelensky declared that it was the policy of Ukraine to retake Crimea by force, and then Ukraine were to join NATO, that would mean that you would instantaneously have a conflict between NATO and Russia. And the likelihood of that turning into a nuclear or thermonuclear exchange, which would annihilate the human species, annihilate the planet, was not far removed. So this is why President Putin insisted that Ukraine must not join NATO, that Ukraine must not develop a nuclear weapon. His warnings, his requests for treaties to that effect were completely brushed aside by President Biden, by NATO, by most of the European Union, and as the Nazi-infested brigades on the Kiev side of the Donbass began an offensive, dropping 1,600 shells on Donetsk in one day, Putin decided that action had to be taken to denazify Ukraine and demilitarize Ukraine. The response from the West was to do exactly what we have been doing only more of it, which was to employ sanctions with the intent to crush Russia's economy. The problem the West has, specifically the Biden administration in the United States, the State Department, our intelligence agencies, and emphatically the British, Boris Johnson, who seems to be spending an awful lot of time in Kiev these days, making sure they don't stop fighting so they can get ground up for the Western war with Russia, was to impose these sanctions, presuming that somehow 3.5, 4 billion people, namely the rest of the planet that's not part of this Five Eyes group or the European Union, would be willing to starve to death to go along with this. And it simply has not worked. Instead, you have coming into being an entirely new paradigm, a new security architecture. The Russians have pegged the ruble to gold, to a gold reserve system. Russia, China, India with 1.4 billion people is refusing to join the anti-Russian sanctions. South Africa, Mexico, Indonesia, many nations are refusing to go along with this. Pakistan refused, so the United States interfered in the Pakistan government and arranged for a no confidence vote against Prime Minister Imran Khan. I understand that since its inception, not one leader of Pakistan has actually served their full 5-year term without something happening to them. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I think that's accurate. So we're at a point now where the only way to step back from the abyss is that people have to come to a higher understanding of the crisis and to realize that there is something more important than ego, which is namely the survival and future of the human race. And to that end, the Schiller Institute convoked a conference last Saturday dedicated to creating a new security and development architecture. It was keynoted by Helga Zepp-LaRouche, and right after she spoke, the ambassador of the Russian Federation to the United States, Anatoly Antonov, also spoke. Both of them made the point emphatically that the crisis in Ukraine, as it's really misnamed, did not begin with the February 24th Russian military action in Ukraine, that the groundwork for this had been laid much earlier. Helga Zepp-LaRouche went through what happened when the Berlin Wall came down and the decision by some, prominently Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, and others, to declare that the United States was the sole superpower on the planet and that no nation should ever be allowed to supersede the technological power of the United States. Now, that would have been bad enough if the United States were still committed to advancing and upholding a high standard of living of its people, but instead the United States was in a full force collapse, as we have been since the Kennedy assassination, in particular, the end of the space program, the end of the so-called post-industrial new age economy where somehow you're supposed to exist without producing anything or growing any food. So we destroyed ourselves and then insisted that everyone else had to destroy themselves too. And if they wouldn't, we would take care of it and we would destroy them. That basically became American policy. Now we're at a turning point because China decided to get 850 million people out of poverty. It's been over many years walking out of the disaster that was the Cultural Revolution under Mao to something much more consonant with the principle of the general welfare of its population. Russia similarly had a very bad experience after the fall of the Berlin Wall. The looting by the West is committed to defending its population, obviously. And you have agreements among these nations, namely the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, of nations that are committing themselves on the principle of the general welfare and the common aims of mankind, even as they each respect the sovereignty of each other and their national differences. So at the conference, which was attended by over 4,000 people online from 65 countries, there were 3 panels dealing with these questions of security and economic development. We're shortly going to watch the speech of Mike Callicrate, an important farm leader, on the agricultural situation, but I would just like to say, prefacing that, because he takes up what is already the sorry, stupid state of affairs in American agriculture, but it should be known that between Russia and Ukraine, they produce 30% of the world's exportable wheat. That Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, is warning that if this conflict is not resolved really immediately, that certain planting seasons will be missed. The embargoes, the sanctions on fuel, and things like that will lead to a result where 1.7 billion people, that's nearly 2 billion out of 8 billion people, okay, that's maybe 23% of the world's population, will be facing famine in the coming months. That is an absurd situation for mankind to be in when it is possible, as we all know, to produce enough food for our current population and the population many times over. So I wanted to take up that question, also this war question. I will just say on that front, it should be known that the Russian Defense Ministry spokesman, Major General Igor Konashenkov, has warned that Russian armed forces will target decision-making centers, including those in Kiev, unless the Ukrainian army abandons attempts to carry out subversive activities and attack targets in Russia. So apparently Ukraine is trying to attack various Russian communication centers and other things. Russia, which so far has not attacked Kiev, as you can see by the fact that heads of state are routinely traveling there, including Boris Johnson, as I mentioned, contrary to all the shrieks over here of alleged war crimes committed by the Russians, which no one bothers to prove, and no mention of the war crimes being committed against the Russians by the Nazi troops of the Zelensky regime. So I'll leave it at that. It's a profound crisis. I think the presentation, which you're going to see from Mr. Callicrate, gives you a sense of the quality of what was discussed at this conference. I can only urge people to go to schillerinstitute.com and watch the opening plenary session, where you hear from Mrs. LaRouche, the ambassador of Russia to the United States, important speakers actually from India and South Africa, who themselves were involved in advising governments. In the case of Sam Pitroda, he was an advisor to the Prime Minister of India, Rajiv Gandhi, and also Manmohan Singh. And then the speaker following him, Jay Naidu, who was in the Mandela cabinet. So this truly was an incredible conference, indicating the possibility of establishing a dialogue among nations, which can lead to a higher principle. But we will focus on the food question this evening, and we'll go to Mr. Callicrate now.
Hello, this is Mike Callicrate from Colorado Springs, Colorado. I want to thank the Schiller Institute and Helga for this opportunity today to present on this panel. I think we need to look at the possibilities that are available to us in addressing this highly concentrated, globalized food system that is leaving a whole lot of people hungry in the world, and farmers, ranchers, and food producers included. So at Ranch Foods Direct, where I spend my time every day, along with Callicrate Cattle Company in St. Francis, Kansas, we have been working on building a more resilient and sustainable food system for about 22 years. But I think it's important to talk about why we have looked at this building of an alternative food system. And so we've always believed that concentration of power and wealth was one of the greatest threats to human civilization throughout history. And President James Madison said, concentrated wealth will destroy our nation unless the laws change. The day will come when our republic will be an impossibility because wealth will be concentrated in the hands of a few. When that day comes, we must rely upon the wisdom of the best elements in the country to readjust the laws of the nation. And I think that is where we are today. The United States Department of Agriculture has inscribed in stone above the main portico of the building, built in, the USDA was formed in the 1860s under President Lincoln. But inscribed in stone is the quote, "The husbandman that laboreth must be the first partaker of the fruits," St. Paul. Well, just the opposite today is occurring. The husbandman, the farmer, the steward of the land is the last to receive any kind of return from the fruits of his labor. And in fact, is being put out of business by this cartel-controlled food system. We're in the dereg business, said President Reagan. Government is the problem. What President Reagan did to antitrust law enforcement in the 80s was the equivalent of referees declaring no rules and leaving the field in a football game. Cheating was not only allowed, it was required and still is. In 1996, U.S. News and World Report did an article called Illegal in Iowa. So 90 years after the Jungle, the book 1906 Jungle by Upton Sinclair, here we are again addressing the same problems. Even though laws were passed to prevent this sort of thing happening again, they haven't been enforced. 90 years after Upton Sinclair published this groundbreaking expose of the nation's meatpacking industry, illegal immigrants are flocking to the United States to take the dangerous, low-paying jobs most Americans won't. The difference between now and then, now there's a system that keeps the illegals coming and the industry humming, and the plants have come to rely on it. Bob Peterson, 1996, said, "There is no stopping it, concentration. This is an evolution that's going to take place in spite of whoever is in the way." This coming from the largest meat packer in the world, Iowa Beef Processors, soon to be owned by Tyson Foods. In 1998, December 1998, I was told by my only buyer, National Beef at St. Francis, Kansas, that they would no longer be buying my cattle. I had 14,000 cattle in a 12,000 head feedlot because I couldn't sell them. And so I called Secretary Dan Glickman, whose responsibility it was to enforce the Packers and Stockyards Act, which would have prevented me from being blackballed by the Packers. And I asked him why he didn't enforce the law. And he says, "Well, Mike, in this modern day of globalization, we need big companies that can do business globally." A judge in the court case that I was part of, a plaintiff in, that was filed in 1996, which led to my being blackballed by the big Packers. A captured judiciary reverses the intent of the 1921 Packers and Stockyards Act to protect producers from abusive meatpacking power. Judge Strom sent very bad precedent when he reversed that 2004 jury decision and award finding Tyson IBP in violation of the Packers and Stockyards Act. And the Supreme Court later refused to hear the case. So Judge Strom took away from the plaintiffs, the cattlemen plaintiffs in the case, a $1.28 billion jury award and any hope of injunctive relief, stopping the meat packers from acting anti-competitively. JBS gives top job to senior U.S. politician, Sao Paulo, Brazil, former U.S. Rep. John Boehner, the 53rd Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, was appointed to the board of JBS Foods International, a subsidiary of Sao Paulo, Brazil-based JBS. So here we have more of the revolving door from government to corporation and back again. John Boehner was important in repealing the country of origin labeling law, as well as reversing much of the intent of the price reporting law that was supposed to protect producers and make the markets more transparent. So business as usual at JBS. After paying $3 billion to settle bribery charges and corruption charges, the Batistas are still in the driver's seat at JBS. August 2017. Also in 2017, JBS hires the former USDA food safety chief, Al Almanza. Al Almanza had been working at USDA for nearly 40 years and had been instrumental in putting small plants out of business with onerous regulations and rules like HACCP. And then, as administrator of USDA, allowed the rotten meat in from Brazil during an 80-day period, which every other country had blocked that meat from entering their or crossing their borders. Al Almanza goes to work for JBS. The monopoly that's standing between farmers and ranchers and consumers and controlling the costs of inputs and the prices of outputs is the major threat to farmers and ranchers and consumers as well in having access to good food. The monopoly is extracting the wealth from this enterprise called agriculture, leaving poverty behind, hungry people, bad food, highly processed foods, and deepening the world's crisis of hunger and lack of food. 4 big meat packers are crushing small ranchers. The JBS cyber attack was only a hiccup in the meat packing operations, but for legislators, the security scare was a sign that it might be time to break up the industry. Again, much like the COVID problem and the breakdown of the supply chain, we are looking to build better, more resilient, safer food systems that will lift people from poverty, not only in agriculture, but people who eat as well. Monopolies are bad. It's been written about by several authors, and Barry Lynn says, fight what's bad while building something better. So let's build something better. What will that look like? Abraham Lincoln and his advisor, Henry Carey, said, we must adopt measures needed for bringing together the producers and consumers of food and wool, and thus augmenting their power to have commerce among themselves. What's that look like? Big food is standing between eaters on one hand and farmers and ranchers on the other. Let's build a system that goes around the big food monopoly cartel. And we've done that with Ranch Foods Direct. And we support the family farm and ranch. We believe the ideal farm is family owned and operated, diversified, livestock centered, responsibly grazing and feeding the farm's production with animal manure going back to the land. A more direct route for producers to connect with consumers wanting to know where their food comes from might be a mobile slaughter unit placed at a livestock operation. Animals are processed where they are, eliminating the stress of transport and improving meat quality by also reducing stress and cost. In 1921, the mobile slaughter unit moved to Montana to be part of a teaching curriculum at Northern Montana College and is now replaced with a purpose-built slaughter floor at St. Francis, Kansas. Carcasses travel 200 miles to Colorado Springs, along with eggs and other food items from the region, and delivered to the Colorado Springs Food Hub, which is the home of Ranch Foods Direct. The final step, in my view, to really restore some well-being back to agriculture, as well as giving consumers better food, keeping money in communities instead of being extracted to global corporations and wealthy elites around the world. I think we build public markets, whether they're publicly owned or privately owned or co-owned by the vendors that are in them. And in my description of the market, the market feeds the city. Owner-operated businesses process and package foods from the region, from meats to grains to seasonal produce. A brewery using local grains and hops, along with many other prepared food makers, sell directly to eaters and eateries. Seasonal markets outflow from the main market, welcoming producers and growers from urban to rural. The energy-filled year-round market is where community happens, a gathering place for residents and visitors. Thank you.
Thank you. So you can see he's thinking about how to address this, how to solve this, but we have currently a situation not only where farmers are having to contend with the cartels, but with skyrocketing prices for food and feed. When I was traveling upstate this week, I met a farmer while I stopped at a rest area, and he said that his price of fertilizer had completely gone out of control, and he knows other farmers who no longer are going to produce corn, but rather wheat and soy because you don't need the same amount of nitrogen. But let me now introduce my colleague, Joel Dejean, who is a LaRouche independent candidate for the U.S. Congress in the 38th Congressional District of Texas. Good evening, Joel.
Thank you, Diane. We do produce food. A large part of it is not to feed people, though. It's put in your gas tank. And Joe Biden this week proved his brilliance by going out to Iowa and meeting with Senator Grassley, the Republican senator, and announcing that we will increase the percentage of ethanol allowed in fuel from 10% to 15%. Now, the basics of energy is what LaRouche called energy flux density. And a gallon of ethanol has only 2/3 the energy content of a gallon of gasoline. And it is hydrophilic, so it can't be transported in the same pipelines as regular oil or crude oil. And a lot of people don't realize that to grow crops, like Diane said, you have to have fertilizer. Now, where does fertilizer come from? Well, it used to come from the manure of congressional leaders, but that wasn't sufficient. So at the beginning of the 20th century, a German scientist by the name of Haber discovered that using a process of natural gas, you can create fertilizer, ammonia. Now, I'm sure Joe Biden is not aware that natural gas is one atom of carbon with 4 hydrogen. Now, to make ammonia, you have to have the air and the methane burn, and in a process called the Haber-Bosch process, you produce ammonia. And that is the fertilizer that most of the modern day farmers use. So what are we doing? We're using corn to put in your gas tank. We're cutting off the supply of natural gas to Europe so that their supply of fertilizer is now threatened. So you have the insanity of the sanctions hitting not only the fuel supply for heating and power, but hitting directly the fertilizer necessary for food production. On top of that, you have lunatics still in Texas, and lunatics include Democrats and Republicans like George W. Bush, who put up 11,000 windmills in West Texas. Now, to give you an idea of energy flux density, because the windmills only produce power about 33% of the time, you need 6,000 windmills of 2.5 megawatts to replace 1 gigawatt nuclear power plant. So what are the Germans doing? They're shutting down their nuclear plants. They're about to cut off oil. They've already cut off coal from Russia. And eventually they want to get rid of Russian natural gas. Now, temporarily, they're using a very energy undense form of coal called lignite, dirty coal. That's what they're using to replace their nuclear power plants. So we have lunacy in the United States. Now, you would expect that from lawyers like Joe Biden and flunkies around him who have no idea of what real science is. But I am amazed by the number of engineers who go along with this nonsense. Because my campaign, a team of 4 people went to Rice University last week, where an environmental engineering professor who claims to be an atmospheric scientist is pushing the line that we can replace fossil fuels with renewables, not nuclear, but wind and solar. This is a form of insanity that can no longer be tolerated. Now, I brought up to this professor that the country where I was born, half the population has no access to electricity, that country being Haiti. The main power supply for Haiti is charcoal. 75% of the energy used for cooking and other household chores in Haiti is charcoal. Now, in 1986, I was in India and I got to see what happens when you don't have high energy density. I saw women at the side of the road collecting cow manure, which they dried on the side of their households to use as cooking fuel. Now, not only is that a poor source of fuel, if you go inside a household using charcoal, cow dung, twigs, or other low density fuels, the air pollution in the household is orders of magnitude greater than the air pollution on the worst day in Los Angeles County. So this lunacy is killing people by cutting off the food supply, cutting off the fuel supply, and giving them no future. So in this proposal that Helga's and LaRouche has put out for a new security architecture, it includes a new economic architecture where we will abandon the lunacy of ethanol, abandon the lunacy of using low energy sources like windmills and solar, go for a full-scale program for small modular reactors, and actually fund a crash program for thermonuclear fusion power in the coming decade. That is the alternative to starvation and war.
Thank you very much. Now, perhaps Dennis Speed has some thoughts. Dennis, go ahead and welcome.
Thanks. I think the most important thing to call attention to at the moment is what we are about to do with our independent campaigns. And I think that a lot of people are going to be involved in that in New York, but I think people all over the United States can be involved. The things that we've just talked about, while they clearly enunciate the character of the problem, are just the beginning of what people are going to have to actually know to confront the circumstance that we're actually in. We have, for example, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States, William Burns, who gave his first speech actually pretty much since he came in March of 2021. He gave that speech at Georgia Tech. And basically what the speech was an indication that the intelligence agencies of the United States are committed to seeking an adversarial confrontation with China and with Russia. Now, if you look at what was just said concerning this question of energy, energy usage, it's important that we say something, though not a lot, about Joe Biden's recent performance, which many people are discussing, at North Carolina A&T, and some of the remarks he's been making generally this past week concerning what he keeps calling Build Back Better World. This refers to something that was being discussed in 2021, right after his election. Let's remember that the first action that he took when he came in, literally the first day, was to signed the Paris Accords, placing the United States in the middle of a lethal agreement whose actual nature is what you are seeing in the weapons buildup that's going on now internationally. There is no intention of implementing the Green New Deal that the greenies like Greta Thunberg are talking about. That's actually never going to occur. The Green New Deal that some of the well-meaning people that might be around the former Bernie Sanders campaigns, for example, are talking about is never going to occur. What's happened is that the thing called the Green New Deal has been appropriated by military and intelligence forces around the world as a way of conducting warfare against something which has become known as the Belt and Road Initiative, because it's most identified with China, but is actually a policy outlook that has been pioneered for the past 4 decades by Lyndon LaRouche and his organization. Americans don't know that that's the case, and what's necessary is to conduct some political campaigns as a way of allowing for the largest possible number of Americans to intersect a process of nonviolent, creative, direct action. If you look at the country and you look at what has been done to the United States, particularly in the form of the undeclared wars of the post-1945 era, whether we're talking about the Vietnam War or we're talking about the Iraq War, the 2 Iraq wars, the assault on Syria, the assault on Libya, the police action in Panama, the action in Grenada, and so on. We can continue to name them. These are all actions that are supposed to go through the United States Congress and be voted on so that the American people make a decision or are involved in the decision to go to war. That has not occurred, certainly since Vietnam. And what you're seeing with this thing called the Green New Deal or Great Reset is the implementation of a policy that was announced in 2019, not by an American, but by the then governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, now former governor, and now he's a special envoy to the United Nations on climate change. And what he announces what he calls financial regime change. So what's being done is that the international financial system is being reorganized using the idea of greenness as the pretext, the so-called moral pretext for carrying this out. What has been happening with respect to Russia and Ukraine is merely that this has been turbocharged. Vladimir Putin recognized, as has Xi Jinping in a different way, and in a different way also other countries, that this is a policy, that is to say, the appropriation of the Green New Deal for the purpose of depopulating various sections of the globe, where, for example, where there has never been an advanced electricity grid, for example, most of the 54 nations of Africa. When you say that you're going to implement green policy in those places, you're saying that you intend to depopulate them extensively. But you have depopulation already being made as a practice in the United States. Look at what has occurred around COVID. People are right now yelling and screaming about what the Chinese are doing with their zero COVID policy in Shanghai. Well, the city of Shanghai, which is 3 times larger than New York City, it's 26 million people as opposed to New York City's 8 million, 8.5 million if you want to be generous. Of course, New York City's been losing population, both because of deaths in COVID and also because people have left the city recently. But if you compare those cities, Shanghai has had 7 deaths from COVID. New York City has had 40,000. But yet people talk about the lack of respect for human life in the case of Shanghai. What's important is to understand that what's happening in the United States is that the population is becoming acculturated to mass death, that there is a, quote, new normal in which, for example, highly contagious strains of disease are now accepted as not being the thing that we should be fighting against. We shouldn't be having, for example, any kind of Apollo-style crash program, not merely about coronavirus, but to study infectious diseases. and to work in a kind of a worldwide collaboration for that. This is not something that people adhere to or seem to. But that may not really be true. It may really more be true that the people of the United States, seeing the rank, not merely incompetence, but the rank disregard, the sort of depraved indifference of the political class, have decided that there's not much they can do. And that's where we come in. That's where these campaigns come in. And particularly the campaign that Diane Sare is running for the United States Senate and is being run also by Joel down in Texas for US Congress. These campaigns require a lot of manpower. They require a lot of people to get involved. But they're really not the campaigns of the candidates. They're really your campaign to maintain or to regain, actually, your freedom as citizens. I think that's what we have to see ourselves being involved in. The campaigning is going to begin in the case of New York on Tuesday. We've got a lot of signatures we've got to collect in a lot of different ways. The requirements are Mississippi-like, by which I mean they're absurd and they're done for the purpose of attempting to stop independent candidates. We have decided that we're going to contest those requirements, not merely by sort of yelling and screaming that they're unjust. We already know they're unjust, and anybody actually knows they're unjust, including the people that perpetrated them. They're also corrupt, but we're going to challenge them by carrying them out, by meeting them, by fulfilling them, so that then what happens is that we can actually place the corruption and the depraved indifference of the electorate, of the electoral system, on display. But more than that, you have a voice that can be made internationally available of Americans that say, no, we're not supporting and we're not going to allow the government to support these forms of depopulation. We're not going to allow government to support policies of British-style genocide. For people that don't know, there's a recent development which the British are trying to cover up, in which it's sort of come to light that there was a policy proposal which was underway, and has now been exposed, that any single male that tried to immigrate into Great Britain was going to be deported to Rwanda in Africa. And that's, I wonder if they're thinking about doing that with the Ukrainian immigrants. We'll see about that. But I bring it up because that kind of mentality, in which the depraved indifference to the fact that you start a war, which Boris Johnson in specific and Liz Truss, as foreign secretary in specific, called for and are trying to perpetrate. They're not trying to get peace. And then the people immigrate out of the country, you're going to send them to Rwanda. That's the sort of idea of predatory government, which doesn't mean big government, which is a different thing we won't go into right now. But the fact that a government is large does not automatically make it predatory. The fact that people in government are predatory and financial houses are predatory and that Wall Street and the City of London are predatory is what makes government often predatory. What we want to do is to offer that we can change all of this. We, the citizens of the United States, we, the people of the United States, we make up the more perfect union, which can only be perfected if we are willing to go out and perfect it, to do something that challenges this form of depraved indifference. And that's what the campaign is dedicated to, and that's what we're about to embark on. And we invite all of you to join us in doing that.
Great. Thank you very much, Dennis. I'll say that Gary Konitz, my official campaign manager from upstate New York, says that in response to the food crisis or the fertilizer costs, local quote-unquote experts are addressing the fertilizer shortfalls with strategies for alternatives like spreading your own waste manure on fields. To say this misses the point is an understatement. I would recommend maybe they should go to Washington, D.C. and collect some waste. There's probably a great deal there. I'm actually expecting that pretty soon these environmentalists they don't want you to eat meat unless it's human flesh. They're probably going to start advocating for cannibalism. But on the petitioning campaign, I would just like to say to everyone who is watching this program now or sharing it, as Dennis said, the petitioning begins on Tuesday, April 19th. Only registered New York voters may sign the petition to put my name on the ballot, and the signatures must be witnessed by registered New York voters, but that's not to say people can't come from out of state and help, as long as you are working with registered New York City voters, or help with clerking and doing other things that we're doing, like looking up people's registration. This also requires resources. Everyone has been talking about the high price of gasoline. New York is a large state. We're going to have a lot of people driving all over the place. We're printing 10,000 copies of petition sheets, and then we're going to have to print 10,000 photocopies of our signatures. And I've printed now 115,000 palm cards so far. So if you can donate, if you're a U.S. citizen or permanent resident, please donate at sareforsenate.com. I just wanted to urge the people do that. I have to say, I actually think the morale of our volunteers is high. People have a sense that we can do this. We've had a number of conference calls with probably among them maybe 200 or so people who are committed to working on this, and we have about another 100 volunteers who've agreed. Just in my recent tour from Rockland County, where I'm based, or Orange County, to Cooperstown, Syracuse, Rochester, Buffalo, we added 40 people who are going to be gathering signatures. But we need more. We should just really soar over this. I think the disregard of the so-called political class for not only the principle of the general welfare, but the right of citizens to have representative government is astounding. In the state of New York, people may know that they redistricted. As Dennis said, this was like Mississippi Freedom Party lines, with crazy districts where you have little curving snake-like sections that are 2 blocks wide, linking chunks of Brooklyn to the east side of Manhattan. That's Nadler's district. You have districts that would make more sense if the Long Island Sound froze over and you can walk over it, because now parts of Long Island are connected to Mamaroneck and things like that in the same district. It's really insane. Well, as people were petitioning, a court found that the redistricting was unconstitutional. It certainly wasn't done according to agreement in a nonpartisan fashion, but people were already gathering signatures for the new districts. So then a judge put a stay on this. It looks like we're going with the redistricted districts now. I don't know if they're going to change them again. And then we had the scandal, as people may have heard, that our lieutenant governor had to resign because he was involved in a scheme. Not only, going back to the Merchant of Venice, had he been involved in a company that was lending out money at 500% interest, but he was involved in a scheme to bundle contributions to get matching funds, which matching funds they're saying is the reason for arbitrarily tripling the number of signatures that I need to get, even though I don't receive matching funds, or minor party candidates need to get, from 15,000 to 45,000. They said they don't want frivolous candidates to get the matching funds. I think they should be more worried about crooks getting the matching funds. So there's all kinds of really ammunition and plenty to fight for on its merits. But I want to go back to the point that Helga made at the conference, which is you really have to understand that nuclear war is not out of the question. People say, oh, nobody would ever do that. Nobody would be that insane. Well, we have people running the United States, the UK, NATO, who are that insane, who are that delusional, who were actually surprised that Russia, China, India, Brazil would not just voluntarily starve themselves going along with the sanctions, that they would reorganize and try and create a system for the survival and future of their populations. Anyone who would be surprised by that is someone not in the real world and not trusted and not shouldn't be trusted to lead. So these are just some of my thoughts, but Joel, if you had further comments on anything you want to say about what's also happening with your campaign in Texas, Wesley Hunt, the Bush baby Republican, or any other thoughts on these matters?
Well, first, it looks like your former lieutenant governor was trying to collect too many Benjamins there. The quality of the Democratic Party leadership, from Hochul to Schumer, gives you an idea why they're trying to legalize marijuana. Because they want people to realize that they're starving and freezing to death, and in the summer will be dying of heat stroke because of lack of air conditioning. But here in Texas, we have our own version of lunatics. There are a handful of Iraq and Afghan war veterans who, like I said before, have learned nothing from their utter failure in 20 years of constant warfare. And their idea is to complain about Biden not giving enough weapons to that Zelensky. And I would dare say that part of the reason why Will Smith got so upset at the Oscars was there was a rumor that Zelensky was going to be awarded the Oscar for Best Bad Actor. And when Will Smith got wind of that, he went up there, and since Zelensky wasn't around, he had to slap somebody, so he slapped Chris Rock. But this is the degeneracy of our culture right now. Now, one good piece of news, last week we had an opera, a Tchaikovsky opera, Eugene Onegin, sung in Russian. And unlike other venues who have canceled not only Russian performers, but actually Russian composers, the opera not only went on, we went there and we got out some of the Schiller Institute campaign for a new security and economic architecture, and a very good response. And then a couple nights later, we went to a performance of St. John's Passion, performed by the Bach Society down here in Houston. But I can assure you that Wesley Hunt, who graduated from West Point in 2004, and LaRouche had criticized West Point back in the mid-90s, saying that where they used to be the premier engineering school, it was the first engineering school in the United States. Now they don't teach engineering anymore, they teach political sociology. And that's why my opponent is going around crowing about his 55 combat missions flying a killer attack Apache helicopter. And he's proud of the fact that he was a diplomat in Saudi Arabia, not even realizing that Saudi Arabia was the country that financed and supplied the hijackers that killed 3,000 people right there in Manhattan and gave George W. Bush and his cronies the excuse they needed, the right stockpile, to go into this perpetual war in the Middle East. So these veterans, instead of realizing the error of their ways, are saying, well, since we didn't find weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, let's go attack a country with either the first or second largest arsenal of nuclear warheads in the world. So these lunatics are not just in New York State. Unfortunately, they've spread around the country. And that's why they can be defeated, because they have a lot of power, but they have an Achilles heel, which is reality. And that reality is going to bring them down. And we got to be there to lay out the alternative.
That's right. Dennis, anything else? I think we could conclude soon, but you may have some thoughts and also say something about what you'll be doing tomorrow.
I think the idea that people have to get is that the things that Joel's saying there and have been said by us otherwise have to be taken seriously in a certain way. Um, Burns, the head of the CIA, was asked about the question of nuclear war, and it was asked in such a way as to ask the question, well, would the Russians use nuclear weapons in Ukraine? Well, first of all, the Russians have no intention of using nuclear weapons except under one circumstance, that they find themselves to be, so as far as they are concerned, threatened existentially, that the very state itself is threatened by the way in which they see a process of internal decay occurring in the transatlantic world, and particularly, for example, in the United States, such that they can expect that the United States would launch a nuclear attack or would be provoked to launch a nuclear attack, probably by the City of London. It's probably the way it would actually happen. We have to remember that in history, one group, one nation, and only one nation has ever used nuclear weapons. And so thinking or assuming that others are more irresponsible than the United States, were we to go on the basis of precedent, doesn't work so well. The problem that we have, and the thing to look at in terms of where we stand tonight, is that you're in a world where rationality, reason, and creativity have to be asserted. You know, this is Good Friday, it was already referenced. And there's something to think about, which is not merely what do you do to prevent the human race from sliding into doom, but what can you do that can inspire everyone from all over the world to a completely higher level of action, of creativity? That's what the idea of our conference last week was about. The idea of a community of principle in which people who are honest and have integrity and have a certain level of courage that gives them the equivalent of genius. That is what our people need to see. You know, Martin Luther King has a statue on the Mall, and everything he stood for and stands for is summarily rejected on a daily basis by the people right down the way on that same mall. That's something that we need to correct, that we as the citizens should correct that. He did it. You know, he was merely a citizen. He had no elective office, had very little power, had very little money. In fact, the family had tremendous money problems, financial problems, upon his decease. But he decided that his nation was not primary, his conscience was primary, and the relationship of his conscience to his God, he was after all a minister, was primary. Something like Gandhi, who said the same thing, that he never thought of himself, Gandhi that is, never thought of himself as a political figure. He didn't think that the actions of making India free were what were his accomplishments. He said, the only thing that I have accomplished is that I have performed certain experiments with truth, and I have usually failed. And I recognize that my striving to carry out these experiments with truth is the only thing that allows me to sleep at night. That's what has to begin to drive the American people again. It's when they see leadership like that and they experience that they'll all come around. They'll all come out of the woodwork. You'll find that there are literally hundreds of thousands of people in the United States and all over the world in other ways that will find their voice. And one thing I'd just like to say otherwise is that we have to remember one of the reasons I think that Diane is particularly qualified as a Senate candidate and just as a representative of the American people is the work that she's done in music with people who are not professional singers. That's the whole point of our course, was that anyone can sing and everyone ought to, because that's a way of finding your voice. That's what these campaigns are about. allowing the American people to rediscover their voice, to resurrect their voice in one sense, which is why today is an appropriate day in particular to have this conversation and to think and reflect upon that idea. So I think that people can find their voice in this campaign, these campaigns. And particularly over the next several days, we need as many people as we can possibly recruit in the New York area, particularly. And otherwise around the country, as many people as can tell people about this campaign and the character of what we have to do. And the same is true for what we're doing in Texas.
Great. Thank you so much. Joel, any thoughts in closing?
Well, keep the fight going there, Senator Sare. Now, it'd be a challenge to get Schumer to sing, but we have to believe in redemption.
That's right. Well, thank you, Congressman Dejean. And that is Joel Dejean. People were asking, I put your name again in the YouTube chat. So everybody, let's have a wonderful, appropriately thoughtful Easter, Passover, Ramadan, and come out of this with the strength to turn the United States in the right direction, which is the mission that we have in particular here. And the world is depending on us to do that. So with any luck, we'll see each other next week. And we'll have 25,000 signatures.